Hello everyone. So in this tutorial I'm going to show you how we can start to create the top of this skull here. So I'm going to use these as my reference, and I'm using PureRef as explained in the previous video. If you haven't checked that out with the complete basics of Zbrush, then watch that first. And here we can see I've got a front, side, and I actually haven't got a back view here, so I may need to get some more reference in a later video. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the front and the side view and a 3/4 view as well. Okay, so we just need to get this basic shape outlined within Zbrush. And before I start, I want to load up my custom UI setup. Again, I run through this in a previous video, so go watch that first. And I'm going to load my custom UI. In fact, I'm going to go to config and load UI. And then I've got my custom ZBrush config. Okay, so we can see I've now got my commonly used brushes, and I've also changed it to blue. You can change this yourself. If you go back to preferences and eye colors, I've changed both my buttons to blue. Again, that's explained in the previous video. If you don't like blue, then you can switch those back. Okay. So let's begin. Where do we start? Let's first of all just scroll down, so I've got my tool selected and my subtool. Okay, so I've currently just got the sphere selected. So let's just go right back to the beginning. Let's go to preferences in ZBrush, and this will just allow you to totally remove everything within the scene and go back to its original scene setup. So let's go to Lightbox Tools, and I'm going to go to projects, and I'm just going to load this dynameshed sphere. Okay, so this is currently dynameshed at a resolution of 64. You go down to geometry, and we scroll down here, we've got dynamesh, and that's a resolution of 64. That's enough for us to just start to push and pull this geometry before we start to increase the resolution. Again, we don't want to move this resolution up too high and start pulling out these forms, otherwise it's going to move less of the clay, and we want to move this up in large chunks. Also, you don't want to divide the mesh, because as we start to stretch and push and pull this geometry, if we divide it, all we're doing is we're just dividing this loose geometry, which is no longer very clean. It's kind of stretched out these polygons into rectangles, in some cases triangles, so we don't want that. So I'm just going to undo all this, turn polyframe back off, keep dynamesh on, and I'm going to keep it at 64 for now. We can bump this up slightly later. So I'm going to use the move tool. We can see that the symmetry is selected. We can see down here activate symmetry is on, and I'm going to create the first part of this brow. Okay, so just start to get these very loose shapes sculpted. Okay, so I'm just pushing and pulling here, and we can see I'm actually using a mouse here. I'm not using my tablet, but when you press left click and drag, then we can see I can work from the bottom and then to the top, drag down from the bottom to the top, and that's going to create that harder edge for this brow area. Okay, so again here, you work from the top and then you push from the bottom, work from the top, push from the bottom. Okay, that's going to push it in. And as for the cheekbone area here, we're going to do something totally different, so don't worry about that bit now. Let's just get this overall shape modeled. So we're just going to focus on the top half of the skull, and then we'll model the jaw in another video. Okay, so we can see the cranial part of the skull. It kind of dips, and it actually comes out quite high there. There we go. And then we can push this one out. Now I have got my brush set to quite high, so I've got the set to over 300. If you set the brush too low, then you're going to just pinch certain areas. So we want to try and set this nice and large so we can pull as much of the geometry out as possible. Okay, so just as a reminder to snap, if you hold shift on the keyboard, it's going to snap to a view. And you may also want to remove the perspective. So we've currently got perspective on, so you can select that, and that's going to turn it into an orthographic mode. That's going to remove the perspective, again, much like 3D Coat. So as you start pushing and pulling the geometry, it's good to re-dynamesh. So I'm just holding Control, left click, and drag away from the model. If you do it on the model, it's going to create a mask, so don't do that. Just hold Control, left click, drag, and then that will re-dynamesh. Okay, so I'm just going to move over to a different reference now. I'm just going to move to a side view, or a 3/4 view. And let's try and line this up. So this case, I need to actually move the brush down and keep pushing and pulling again from the top to the bottom, just to create that harder edge there. Okay, and it doesn't have to be absolutely dead on right now. We just need to get this overall shape. We can see that the skull actually comes in here. And as we're starting to sculpt, I'll probably use something like the trim adaptive just to start to trim away some of this, or the trim dynamic that's going to very loosely trim some of this geometry. And then I can hold shift just to smooth that back out. Okay, but we're predominantly going to be using the move and the snake hook tool right now. So I'm going to just push this in slightly. And then let's look at our side view. So I'm just going to move this around to this side just so it matches the same orientation. And then we can see that this side is far too high, so we need to bring this down. And it's already starting to line up pretty well. So again, ignore the jaw, we're just focusing on the top section of the skull. So I'm going to drag this out, but then I'm also going to push this in. So as you increase the resolution, you're not going to be able to pull as much of this geometry. It's going to start to pinch. So even though it's going to be set to a larger brush, it's going to start to have this effect on the geometry. So that's why it's always good to just start very low. Start with 64. That's good enough to just start to push and pull this geometry, and then increase as you start to add more details. So we're just doing the basic blocking, and then we'll increase the resolution. And if you really start to stretch the geometry as we are here, if I just turn on this polyframe again, we can see it starting to stretch. Just re-dynamesh, Control, left click, and drag. And that's going to clean up the geometry. Okay, so now that I've gone back to the front view, we can see that it's kind of squished inwards. So I'm just going to go back to our front view. And you notice I've got two front views. This one's just slightly higher than this one. This is a lower angle. We can tell that the camera is probably set on a table, whereas this one is just slightly higher up. That's just going to give us two different perspectives here. I feel like this one's a little bit more orthographic, whereas this one has a lot more perspective in. So you can go and flick between the two, orthographic and perspective, and use those references. So it's good to use multiple references when you're modeling. So we can see here it actually started to get a little bit too thin, so we can use something like the inflate tool and just inflate that geometry just a little bit, and then control left click and drag to reDynamesh. So we can see in this this reference, we can't actually see the skull. So this section, if you imagine you could draw through this, it would look something like this. We can't actually see the bottom section of the skull, whereas in the model we can. So that means we're going to have to move this up until we can't see it. Okay, that's better. And then just in case, we'll go back to our side view. And we'll try and line this up again. Now, although these skulls share the same characteristics, they're not always going to be perfect. Every single skull is going to look slightly different. So take that with a pinch of salt. There are some areas that are going to be slightly bigger than others in other references. So just keep that in mind. It's not always going to be the same. The best thing to do is to get a scan that has a front, back, and side view. They're going to be the most precise references to use. Okay. It's not looking too bad. We can see that it doesn't just turn, it's not just totally flat, it does turn upwards here. So let's try and emphasize that. Don't worry about this being absolutely perfect to this stage. We just need to get a rough idea of, you know, where this geometry is. We can start sculpting into it with more detail. So this is just the blocking. That's looking okay. You can see just push up, push down, and you're going to start to form that line, and then reDynamesh, control left click drag to reDynamesh. So back to the front. What is this section? Oh, okay, yep, that's fine. I can just pull that back up slightly. Just push this skull back. And that's looking pretty good. So at this stage, I'm going to reDynamesh at a higher level because I want to try and push in these eyes. But I'm not going to turn it up too much. I'm going to set this to about resolution 80 and then reDynamesh. So I've got a little bit more to work with here. There's two ways that we could actually do this. We could either use something like the standard brush, and we can sculpt inwards, so you can hold Alt on the keyboard and then just left click and drag to sculpt. Okay. Or another technique is to hold Control, left click and drag, so I can start to draw out where these eyes are going to be. And I need to hold Control, left click away from the model, so that's going to invert it. And if you feel like it's a little bit too sharp, you can press Control and left click on that mask just to soften it. For now, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to have it harsh like that. I can then move to a side view and go to the move tool and then just move these eyes backwards. Okay, so that might be the easiest way, especially if you want to sculpt out a specific shape with that mask. So I can go back to draw, I can left click and drag, I can left click and drag again to redynamesh, and now we've got that effect. So if you use the standard brush, it's going to be a lot smoother. If you use this technique by masking and then moving it back, you're going to get that nice harsh line. So it's up to you which technique you want to use. For now, I'm just going to stick with this masked version. That's looking pretty good. So I'm going to go back to that move tool and just make some slight iterations. I'll be sculpting into this with more detail. So for now, again, just need to get that basic shape. Let's move these eyebrows down a little bit. It's looking a bit better. There we go. And we can use the exact same technique with the nose. So I can go back into that standard brush. I can hold, control, left click and drag. Okay. And then press control, left click away from the model. So now this is selected. I can then go to the move tool. I'm going to go to that side view and then move this back. Now I am using Zbrush 2019. I'm pretty sure the newer versions look slightly different. The move tool might look slightly different, especially if you got an earlier version. You won't get this little gizmo. You'll also, right at the top here, you'll have a little head sculpt, and you can easily turn from, you know, front, side, back view just through moving the head sculpt. So that's the newer version of Zbrush. So right, so that's looking okay. Let's move that back just a little bit more. And then I'll press Control, left click and drag and do that twice away from the model. And I'm just switching back to the draw mode. If you're confused as to where your brush is, it's because you're still on move. We need to go back to draw. And then we'll just smooth this out. Okay, back to move tool. And I'm just going to move this back up. Again, we can use that inflate tool if you just need to inflate an area. Okay, so it's already starting to take shape. Let's pull this down. Make that eye socket just a little bit thinner. There we go. And you notice you make really small adjustments. You don't just try and push and pull really quickly and try and get good results. Be very patient with it. So again, on the front, in the back, keep doing it that way. So we can see this fang actually sticks right out. So here it's kind of following up into the nose area. So I'm just trying to accentuate that in this model, at least in this block-in. We can actually see that the back teeth don't actually come too far back, whereas in my model they do. Let's just switch back to perspective mode. Okay, so we can see that I do just need to try and move this back slightly. If I just follow this line up, it comes to about here. If I follow this line up, it's still within right near the end of the eye socket. So let's try and do something similar there. Okay, where does that line come up? Just a little bit more. Let's do it to about there. Yep, that looks better. Now, I'm pretty sure this is really long, so I need to just push this down slightly. That looks a bit more like it. Let's go back to this one. Yeah, it was really long. Let's just push that back. That's more like it. I suppose if you wanted this to look a little bit more alien, then you could keep it that way, but for me, I'm just going to keep this the same as my reference. Okay, so that's looking good. It's starting to look very pixelated. If I go and re-Dynamesh again, this is pretty much as far as we can go. If we want to start to apply more detail, again, we're going to start to see all of these. Let's just turn the frame on. We can see all these polygons. And that does not look pretty. So let's increase the resolution to about 120. Okay, and then re-Dynamesh, control left click and drag. And now we can hold shift and smooth. And we can see we've got an awful lot more to work with. So I'm just going to smooth out some of those polygons. And we can start to add some sculpted details now. So I'm going to go back to that front view. And let's start to use the Damien standard. So Damien standard is going to cut straight into this mesh. Okay, so it's going to create these lines. If I hold Alt, then it's going to create a line that comes out. So let's say, for example, this top section of the skull here. Let's just move the skull up. We can actually see that I need to move this skull back a little bit and up. That looks a little bit better. So just make those fine adjustments if you need to. So I'm going to go back to Damien standard. I'm going to make the brush just a little bit smaller. I'm going to hold Alt on the keyboard and then don't want this to look like a spike. There we go. So I can now go back to my standard brush. I could start smoothing out some of these areas. And I'm basically just going to fill this in slightly with that standard brush. That's looking okay. And then I can continue going back to Damien standard. And a lot of this is going to get lost when we re-Dynamesh. We just want to get that basic shape. And the intensity is quite high. Let's set this to about 10. That looks a bit better. There we go. And the same for underneath the eye. So I'm just going to hold left click and drag just underneath. Let's set this to about 15. That's a bit better. And you see here we've just got a slight kind of indent here that we can add with that Damien standard. Very quickly, there we go. So I just redynameshed there and we can see that it's still there, but it's lost an awful lot of detail. So at this stage, again, don't worry too much about adding loads of details. We're just moving on to the next stage. We've got our basic block out, we've got our basic shape. Now we can start to push and pull this geometry a little bit more. I'm just noticing that this section here is a little bit too wide. So let's just move this down. That looks better. And then here, this comes up almost like a tube shape. So I can go back to standard and then I can just sculpt that in there. So these are the kind of changes that you can make at this, albeit still slightly low resolution. We've got this set to 120. I would bump this up to something like 260 if I wanted to start adding more detail. And then I can use that divide if I want to add even more detail. Okay, so for now we're just going to block these shapes in. So I'm just switching between cutting in by holding Alt and then just holding left click to sculpt outwards. So I've just noticed that if I just pull this nose down slightly, I think it is just a little bit longer. The bottom section of this mouth here is quite small, whereas mine is quite large, so I might need to go back to the move tool and just move this up slightly. I think it should be just about there. Yep, that looks more like it. I'm going to go back to that Damien standard. You'll notice I use the same brushes over and over again. The move tool, snake hook tool is really good just to pull out sections. Standard brush if you want tube shapes. If you want to very slowly start to build up on the geometry, then you can use the clay build up tool. You can set the intensity a little bit lower and you're just going to slowly start chipping away at it. So if you slowly want to start adding geometry to the model, then you can use the clay build up. Okay, this one's really handy. There we go. And also clay tubes, which is the same, but just more of a tube. And inflate and smooth. So, same brushes, and you can create an awful lot just with those limited brushes. I like to have them right down the bottom, so it just saves me from having to search from here. Right, that's looking okay. I might need to Dynamesh, use the inflate tool. This was starting to dip slightly. That's looking a bit better. There we go. Back to the move tool, and then push and pull again. Okay, so next stage, I'm going to re-Dynamesh again, but this time I'm going to set this to something like 160 and re-Dynamesh. Sometimes you need to just make a selection first. You can hold shift and smooth and then re-Dynamesh. And now we've got quite a lot more detail here. We're going to create this section here, the top of the jawline. And this actually connects with the eye socket. So the technique I like to use is we can use the snake hook tool and just push this out. Yeah, so we can do it that way. And then push it this way. And then we'd need to re-Dynamesh just to fix some of this geometry. We can also make a mask first, so we can make a mask right on the eye socket or just on the edge here. I can hold Control, left click and drag to make that mask selection. Then Control, left click away from the model, and now it's only going to snake hook on that section that I've just selected. Okay, so it doesn't come too far out. Let's have a look. So it comes out just slightly here. So I can pull this out. I can then go to, let's go to a top view, and then let's try and stretch it the other way. Okay, so I've made it just a little bit smaller. We can see it's really stretching those polygons. And that's where we'd need to press Control, left click and drag just to re-Dynamesh. And let's look at a different view. So we've got this one here. So it does come out of the side of the skull here. So I could do the same technique, Control, left click, just to make my mask. Control, left click away from the model to invert. And then use that snake hook tool just to bring that little section out. Okay, so I'm going to try and make these join right about there. And then Control, left click, drag to unmask, and then do the same thing to re-Dynamesh. So they are joined here, but it's very, very thin. So I'm going to use that inflate and just inflate this area. And then re-Dynamesh away from the model. Okay, and then I'm just smoothing this out. So that's how we could do that. We can just drag it out, re-Dynamesh, drag the other side out, re-Dynamesh them together, and then inflate them. So here I can go into my adjustments. I can go to movement and just move this down. So use the move tool or the snake hook tool if you want a finer movement. There we go. So we're starting to sculpt that shape in there. And then the move tool to make larger adjustments. There we go. So here I'm just moving into the side view. We can see that this actually cuts up closer to the brow of the eye socket, but we can also see that we can't see the stern. We can't see the nose there, whereas we can in our model. So we're going to need to make that adjustment. We're going to need to push this forward, push the eye socket out, or the eyebrow out, and then just pull this one in. There we go. So always go back to your reference. Don't just do this blindly. Go back to your front, back, and side views and make sure it's all lining up. So I might need to use that snake hook tool and just push this in slightly. And then use that standard brush just to pull this up. That's looking okay. Okay, so here it's actually going all the way down, whereas in my reference it's coming up above the skull. Let's have a look. Could just push it up and then just use the Dynamesh. Yeah, I think that'll be okay. That looks fine. Again, re-Dynamesh, smooth. Can use that standard if I need to just pull this out slightly. And I can use the Damien standard if I really want to try and make a thin line there. So there I use the mixture of cutting inwards and then holding Alt to extrude outwards. Okay. You can also, which I've explained in the previous video, but I'll show you here, if you cut inwards, like this for example, and then hold Alt, and then this is going to extrude out on this side. Let's just increase this intensity to over exaggerate this. And then hold Alt and left click on the other side, so we've got this indent. If you go to pinch, then we can pinch these together and create a smooth line. Okay, I'll just turn that intensity down to about 10 just so you can see that. Okay, so the area where it was extruded on the two outsides, and then we've got the extrusion on the inside, it's going to push them together to create that edge. So I'm using the same technique there, but I'm just not pinching these together. So back to Damien standard, I'm going to select left click to extrude inwards, and then hold Alt to extrude outwards. Right, so I've just sculpted into it a little bit more using the same tools: Move Tool, Standard, Damien Brush, Damien Standard, and it's looking pretty good actually. It's looking like very similar to our reference. So we've got this set to resolution of 160. We're going to just bump this up now so we can start to add a little bit more detail. So I'm going to do, let's say, 230. And then redynamesh. And I'm just smoothing out these areas that are looking kind of pixelated. Okay, and I'm going to leave this video here and move on to the next one, where I'm going to continue sculpting into it, add a little bit more detail, and then we can start to add the teeth and also model the rest of the jaw. Okay, excellent. Well, I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.